Our guest on today's episode is Brendan Graham Dempsey of the Metamodern Meaning, formerly known as the Metamodern Spirituality podcast, which I will link down in the description. And you may have seen I was been a guest on that a couple of times over the years, and yeah, always love chatting to Brendan. We cover a lot of theoretical ground and big topics, and it's just a lot like play to me. In this episode we talk a lot about meta theory and Brendan's new job working at the Institute of Metatheories, doing research on worldviews across the world, which is really fascinating. He introduces me to a psychological model that quantifies the complexity of text, and so of course we get into talking about the complexity of books of the Bible versus Homer versus me texting my mom. If this conversation tickles your grey cells and you're the kind of person that is very curious about the big questions in life, about how all human knowledge and experience connects together, then can't recommend Brendan's podcast and his work enough. I got very excited about meta theory here, and so we kind of ended up going into that, and so we didn't get to talk about his book as much as I wanted to, but I'm sure there will be plenty more opportunities in the future because Brendan's always a great one to talk to. So I had a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy it, and yeah, if you did, there's a lot more over on Brendan's channel. Hello, Brendan. We're chatting again about God knows what this time, but it's great to have you again. Actually, I guess this is the first time you're on my podcast.
This is true, but yes, we always have great conversations. So thanks, James. Appreciate you inviting me on your podcast. And I have no idea what we're going to discuss, but I think it's going to be amazing.
Well, you did mention you've got, so there's two things, and we can go either of these directions, but you mentioned you've started work in a new place. That's really cool. And you've also finished another book. So which one of those would you like to dig down on?
Yeah, well, I guess they're all kind of related, but I recently have embarked on a full-time position now doing research at the Institute of Applied Metatheory. And, this isn't your grandmother's, your grandparents' applied meta theory. This
This is not homegrown meta theory.
This is next level. So, I'm really psyched for this. I've been working with this team for a bit, kind of in a passion volunteer context, and now coming on full time. So I'm going to be really, directing a lot of the research initiatives. And, we've already got a couple of initiatives going. We're starting some new ones. A lot of it is really exciting. I think genuinely kind of groundbreaking sort of worldview research. What are worldviews? How do you study them? How do you measure them? Are they developmental or not? There's a lot of questions that come out of certain kinds of meta-theoretical models that look at individual and collective development and try to situate the human in terms of an evolving kind of cultural evolutionary process, but cosmic evolutionary process. And I know that you've been influenced by and also leveled some nice critiques against some of the integral and metamodern models, but we're really trying to make those more robust, give them more empirical grounding, and kind of take it to the next level, next generation of this sort of meta theory.
That sounds pretty cool. So before I guess we get into the details of that, what is meta theory?
Is basically, there's lots of ways you can kind of try to offer a quick summary of this. The basic idea would be sort of a theory of theories, but it's a way of situating theories, right? So a theory, let's say, you've got a particular theory of the mind, let's say Carl Friston's, predictive processing. That's sort of like a nice, beautiful theory. But then you've also got, let's say Darwinian evolutionary theory, and you've got maybe Freudian theory or Jungian theory, and you've got a bunch of these theories floating around. They're all trying to account for certain things. And then the question is if the world is one, if there is some coherence to all this, how do you actually link these up in a way where you're not just kind of awash in all these different theories of how things work, but you're actually able to see how they're kind of touching one part of the elephant, as it were. So you're able to sync up, coordinate different theories, and that gives you a meta-theoretical sort of vantage. So, maybe the best way of thinking about it for the work that I'm doing is I'm really interested in looking at cultural transformations and evolution through the lens of, let's say, cognitive development. So there you've got something like an individual psychological set of theories and a sociological collective, set of theories. And then how do these relate? So that requires a kind of inter or transdisciplinary approach that you wouldn't really be able to get from any existing sort of discipline. So, it would be hard to do this kind of work in just a psychology department. It would be hard to do it in even just a sociology department. You really have to bring together multiple fields to see how these complex interactions are unfolding. And to do that, well, I think you need good meta theoretical maps and models. And so there's, not too many of those out there, but there are a handful, and they do, offer a lot, and they're very promising for how you can begin to build bridges across different theoretical approaches and disciplines. So that's a big part.
I'm thinking cognitive science is kind of, I wonder if you would consider cognitive science a meta theory, because it brings in very different fields, from AI to systems thinking to psychology to neuroscience. But I guess it's still limited within a certain scope. And I'm guessing that like spiral dynamics, these metamodern, I guess, cultural hierarchy or cultural eons, or even the cultural logics that you talked about in your book, would those all be examples of meta theory? Some of them, none of them?
I mean, cognitive science as a field is certainly interdisciplinary, and it has a broad reach, broader than a lot of other disciplines. There is still a clear kind of set of delimiting aspects there. It has a lot of applications in different areas, but it's also, there are things that it doesn't touch. There are things that it doesn't bring into its ken. And so, generally speaking, certainly anyone operating in these different fields might be pushing those boundaries somewhat.
So is that to say that meta theory doesn't have edges? Meta theory kind of is all-encompassing?
To appreciate a kind of coherent, coordinated gestalt of human knowledge, right? So, in fact, if people are familiar with Greg Enriquez's The Unified Theory of Knowledge, right, which he picks up that idea of unified there from E.O. Wilson, and the idea of consilience, right? How do we link up the different knowledge forms across, basically the natural sciences and the social sciences and the humanities? Is there some way of bringing those two, those things together in something that's coherent? And I think people have been attempting some version of that in various ways for some time. And so, I would say neuroscience is a kind of a field doing certain kinds of things in that spectrum of analysis. But there are things outside of it. Whereas meta theory is endeavoring, I think, towards something comprehensive. It is sort of it's an attempt to map the big picture, as it were, right? And to try to bring together all these fields of knowledge into something that we can sync these up and relate them. I think things like spiral dynamics are, I wouldn't class them as meta theories per se. I think that they offer interesting early attempts to try to bridge across different kinds of disciplinary divides, like the cognitive and the cultural. I think some of those are done with more nuance and sophistication than others. So I think spiral dynamics maybe hits on some really interesting patterns that it identifies, but as in my reading, doesn't really do a great job really bringing out the causal explanations and the theory behind a lot of this. It's just sort of like, hey, look at this. There's this, it works a lot more like a typology than kind of a comprehensive meta theory. Something like a Freinach's metamodernism moves more in the direction of meta theory for sure. I believe Hansi has sort of said I'm not doing meta theory, and other people kind of disagree. And they say, yes, you are. Okay. But just the very fact that, there is an attempt in his model to say, appreciate that you've got cognitive complexity and sort of the individual level, but there's also cultural code. And there are things like depth and state. There's an attempt to bring together different modalities into a comprehensive synthetic whole that is illuminating. And so I think that's a lot closer to the meta theoretical move than others. But yeah.
So what about Greg's UTAC would be explicitly meta theory then, would it?
Greg, in his work, is a prime example of meta theory, because what he's doing there is bringing together all these different knowledge disciplines and trying to situate them relative to each other, and understanding from a kind of systematic non-speculative metaphysical level why and how all these things relate to each other. So from matter to life to mind to culture, that's kind of his complexity stack. Then you can start to sync up, well, what are the different fields of knowledge? Well, okay, physics is looking at matter, and biology is looking at life, and psychology in the kind of basic sense is looking at, animal mindedness on into human mindedness, and culture is sociology and the humanities and the social sciences and all that. So you can actually begin to appreciate what these different disciplines are, their levels of analysis, their levels of complexity. And not only that, this is all tied into a kind of comprehensive story, a big history story of cosmic evolution. So it's not just saying, here's where these all line up. It's saying, here's where all these came from. And if you really go deep into his model, he's got theories for why and how these different planes of complexity emerge. He's got different theories at the so-called different joint points that kind of establish these novel layers of complexity. So it's a very, I think, sophisticated, very robust model. And I highly recommend his work, as particularly his, I think, last book that came out in 2023. It's called A New Synthesis. And so, I would say that that's kind of one of the gold standards right now, as far as I'm concerned, for folks interested in meta-theoretical modeling.
So I'm thinking while you're talking there about Thomas Kuhn's definition of a paradigm. And he says that a paradigm, among his many, many definitions, as he later acknowledged, but one of the core ones is that it, as well as being a disciplinary matrix, there's an exemplary type of problem and there's an exemplary type of solution.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what the content of meta theory is. Like, what is the bread and butter that is being worked with? Because obviously it seems like the bread and butter is theories, but I don't know if that's right. But what is a day in the life of a meta theorist look like?
Different questions, but certainly related. I mean, I think that one of the things that's different about this line of inquiry compared to, say, what happens in most sort of university departments is that there's an explicit desire to get a big picture framing on reality. If you're operating in a discipline, right, you might have a particular inquiry that you're interested in, and you might study something. Maybe you're an even kind of more of a generalist, but you still are sort of engaging, let's say, psychology from, hey, I draw on Freud, I draw on Jung, I draw on Erikson, I draw on Piaget. Maybe there's a bunch of different theoretical models that you work, and that makes you a bit more comprehensive. But you're still kind of just in the field of psychology, right? You haven't necessarily, maybe you start to touch in a little bit, oh, well, there's Vygotsky, and that brings in some of the cultural and the social stuff. But it's not like you've gone also into then quantum mechanics and then, the periodic table of elements and chemistry and abiogenesis. And, so in that sense, in the kind of, I think, standard academic disciplines, you're working in a very disciplinary, often very siloed way. And that's great for certain kinds of inquiries, right? I mean, we need, and again, back to that sort of Kuhnian sense, right? Like, we need people doing normal science. And so that happens usually in these disciplines of like, here's my inquiry, here's my question, here's my hypothesis, I'm going to test this, at least if you're doing something more scientific. Or in the humanities, hey, I'm reading this book and I'm working in a hermeneutic way and I'm going to draw out this element of interpretation, whatever. That's most of what academia does. And what it doesn't do very well is try to bring the insights from across these different disciplinary silos together into a comprehensive picture of reality. I mean, in fact, some disciplines, they kind of bracket reality entirely and just say, oh, we're just doing something disciplinary here. Don't trouble us with philosophy, or certainly not truth. And I think that meta theory is really is dedicated to trying to bring a coherent pluralism out of that fragmented pluralism of the current institutional knowledge.
But I guess my question is, what is because you've kind of hit on the word there, normal science. So obviously Kuhn distinguishes between normal science and revolutionary science. Revolutionary science is how you bridge between paradigms. But the kind of bread and butter work of a paradigm is normal science. What's the normal science of meta theory?
That's a really interesting
I could
question.
see like Wilbur's model, integral theory, as being a paradigm of meta theory, and then that kind of breaking down, going into crisis, whether something has emerged. There wasn't a clear linear emergence out of that, but it seems like that was a clear paradigm within which a lot of work was being done, and within which
Sure.
you call that metatheoretic. So I could understand what the normal science of integral theory was, I guess. So I'm wondering, within the school that you're
Yeah,
in.
this is interesting. There's a couple different ways you could think about that. I mean, one of the ways of thinking about that is that a normal science of meta theory might be the basic application element, right? So once you have a meta theory, let's take integral as an example, then you can start to apply it. So in that sense, then if you're kind of quote unquote working within the paradigm, you're like, hey, all right, we've got these quadrants and we've got these lines and levels. All right, let's look at ecology and ecological practices and do an integral ecology, right?
Mhm.
And then you can write a book. And then, I mean, and folks have done great work like this. So, that kind of stuff exists. Or you look at medicine, and you're like, all right, what does it mean to do an integral medicine? So there was a whole field, kind of cottage industry for a while of people doing integral approaches to X.
Mhm.
And in some ways, you could look at that as sort of normal science in meta theory. You've got a meta theory, and then you kind of do the work of applying it and see how it all kind of plays out. Another way of thinking about, in some senses, what normal meta theory is, but in some ways might actually be something more like normal arch theory, which I'll explain in a second, is actually the development of meta theories themselves. So maybe, the normal science of meta theory is, oh, okay, Wilbur did this. Well, what did he do? He took a bunch of different theories and approaches and perspectives and disciplines, and he synced them all up in a coordinated map. Okay, so how can I do that? And then you get modelers and map makers and sort of, you could call them epistemic cartographers or something, right? Trying to draw out the ways that you can map all these things together. And in a sense, doing what, some philosophers attempt to do, which is carving nature at its joints, right? And I think meta theory and kind of certain kinds of philosophy are akin in that sense. So that might be a different way of thinking about sort of classic meta-theoretical normal science. I mentioned arch theory, though, and this is this other element, right, where this actually might be something a little different, because once you start having multiple meta theories on the table, you can also then begin to compare and coordinate those, right?
Yeah.
So this actually leads to an even higher,
right? Okay,
higher, exactly. And so again, as the metas accrue, you need to start coming up with new terms.
Yes.
So the work of Corey David Barker has been great. He helped kind of coin the term arch theory, and other people are working in this sort of at this particular disciplinary level, or also it's called arch disciplinarity. And I actually co-authored a book with him along with some others called Foundations of Arch Disciplinarity, if people are interested in this. But the idea there is to say, all right, just as meta-theoreticians were taking multiple theories and try to sync up the coordinated patterns that hold them all together, what happens if you do that at a higher level of analysis to meta theories, right? So now you've got, let's say, integral theory and U-talk, Greg Enriquez's model, and you then try to coordinate those together and see what are these doing that are the same, and then this leads to kind of comparative meta theory, which is leading to new kinds of levels of synthesis at a high level to see what actually holds or obtains between these levels of analysis, and that's something called arch theory. Which is another thing that some meta-theoreticians might get up to if they have
is it
a
possible
little extra whiskey.
that there will in the future be meta arch theory? Because
of course,
once there's a lot of arch theory, then someone will do we'll
all the way to the
that.
Singularity, my friend. Yeah, this is what keeps meta-theoreticians in business. You understand? It's just that it's a recursive iteration.
The recursivity is where all the three jobs of the future are. So I guess let's talk about what you're actually going to be doing then. So did you say, are you working on? I mentioned to you before we started talking that I saw, I think it was on the group or the Metamodern Spirituality group or somewhere else, about some research being done on worldviews across the world to actually quantify this and to actually go about measuring it. Is that something you're involved in?
That have already launched that I'm kind of deeply involved in. Probably what you're referring to is our newest ones, the Worldview Studies Initiative. That has multiple prongs to it. I'll list kind of a few of what we're up to, and then I'll get into the specifics of them. But yeah, one of them is the WSI, the Worldview Studies Initiative. Another, also related, is called the CCI, the Cultural Complexity Index. Another I'm deeply involved in is the Faith Development Pathway. And all of these are looking at worldviews and meaning-making structures and trying to be a bit more empirically rigorous about how we talk about those, understand them, etc. So just starting with like the Worldview Studies Initiative, there's a couple of elements to that we're keen to explore. One of them is just doing some kind of cleaning up, theoretical underlaboring. Like, what do we mean by a worldview? What is this concept, right? It gets thrown around a lot, but do we actually have like a systematic understanding of what that is, what it does? And so getting clear about the differences, for example, between a worldview and say a paradigm or a justification system or an episteme, or, there are a number of these kind of broad
Soul has
overarching
visions. Like, I don't know if you know Thomas Sowell's one. He has like the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. So he's got another term for that kind of like large cultural level or whatever. Or I guess even Heidegger's Dasein is kind of the fundamental concept of that. Like, your being in the world. What is the... Well, I mean, I guess that has a very specific context within it, but it does kind of capture an element of the lived experience of how what Kuhn talks about is like living in different worlds if you're in different paradigms, but it applies to worldviews as well, I guess.
The benefit from is some clarity around these different terms and how they relate to each other. So this would be a kind of meta-theoretical effort to try to systematize this terminology in this taxonomy to some degree, because when you can get clarity around that, then there's not that semantic slippage. You're actually being more scientific about what you mean. I love Jason Storm's work, but I was reading his book again recently, and he mentions at one point, he's like, I'm very skeptical of this idea of worldviews. What does it mean for someone to have a worldview or share a worldview and all this stuff? And he raises some great, critiques of this idea. And I think all those can and should be answered from a scientific worldview studies program that can actually have an understanding of what it means by its object of analysis. So if we're going to be studying worldviews, we should be clear about that. So that's a first step to that, is sort of like beginning to map out those distinctions. And also, to be clear, some of these distinctions that have been floating around maybe are, what do they say, distinctions without a difference. Some of them are probably all of them are pretty under-theorized. Some of them are very well theorized, but then need to be synced up relative to each other. So maybe there's some overlap between Dasein and worldview and paradigm, and right. But like, what are these specific things getting at? How are they different? But anyway, that's a big part of that, and that's purely kind of theoretical.
Well, I mean, that seems like a paradigmatic kind of like thing to nail down, because if you don't have that going in, then you're just fraught with problems. So that it's good to have that clarified in advance before any research goes in.
And then as that develops and as we move forward with that, then there's a whole empirical set of questions that we're trying to explore here. So, coming back to the integral model, for example, let's say you say, there are these multiple worldviews, and these worldviews are developmental, and they transcend and include. It's like, okay, that's a number of claims that have been made, and can we validate or test them or falsify them, right? So again, what's a worldview? What do we mean by developmental, and how could we measure or test that? So there's a couple angles into those kinds of questions. One of them, and this starts to get into some of these other initiatives, right? Like the CCI, which is looking at actually assessing the complexity of particular representative texts or linguistic samples from different worldviews and seeing how they relate developmentally, which again has never been done, right? We tend to say, the modern is more complex than the pre-modern. It's like, okay, well, give me some evidence, please, right? And until any of this is sort of done with any degree of scientific rigor, all these questions are just going to stay at the level of sort of sociological, speculative theorizing, and get properly not taken so seriously in the academy, in the institutions of knowledge. So we're trying to change that. We think that there's something there to these models, but it's one thing to kind of make a claim and then run with it, or work with certain kinds of, orienting generalizations, as Wilbur was fond to do. It's another thing to say, all right, let's put these ideas to the test. Let's actually get the quantifiable data that can assess what is a developmental progression of perspectives. And then let's actually use those numbers to start doing statistical analysis and so on and so forth. So, one more thing, on the... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, well, where is that idea of complexity coming from, or how is that being measured? Is that akin to... Because Hansi talks... That's one of Hansi's 4 dimensions, right? Complexity. And is that to my mind, is that the one that kind of overlaps with IQ?
We share with Hansi's analysis is called hierarchical complexity. It's really kind of the
commons model, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing that Hansi doesn't really talk much about is that it's not just commons. There's a whole neo-Piagetian tradition that works with hierarchical complexity. Commons is a really important thinker who did some great work formalizing some of this stuff. But arguably, at least in my opinion, the program that I think was even more effective was dynamic skill theory in the work of Kurt Fischer and sort of his legacy, also working with hierarchical complexity. What we do is, one, expand that kind of framework a bit. So it's not just Commons' model. It's sort of, what is hierarchical complexity? How does it come out of the neo-Piagetian tradition, et cetera? And all this stuff I actually get into in my newest book that just came out, Psyche and Symbolic Learning, where I go through the whole history of sort of developmental psychology through the neo-Piagetians on into the kind of cutting edge metrics, which are basically the work that Lectica is doing. So Theo Dawson of Lectica has operationalized hierarchical complexity as a metric that you can score through automated tools. She has something called the computerized lectical assessment system that measures hierarchical complexity in texts. And she's been working on this for 30 years. It's mind-blowing, the implications of this thing. I mean, the rigor and the construct valid. I can't go into and sing its praises enough, because I mean, having read all of her work, I think I can say all of her work. I think I've read pretty much everything she's written. It's absolutely brilliant stuff. And what it allows us to do is measure hierarchical complexity in linguistic performances. And if you have a tool like that, then you can start to put these claims to the test. You can say, all right, well, basically, if you look at like a Wilbur, map, and it's like, okay, well, here's Commons and Piaget, and there's like a cognitive line, and it goes up, blah, blah, blah. And then this syncs up with this model, and this syncs up with this model. You can actually test that, right? So that's what we've been doing, and finding interesting, largely validating, but also really unexpected kinds of results, which is what you often really want.
Interesting. Like what?
Yeah. Well, okay. So what we do is, using lectical scoring, we have established definite correlations between other stage models and hierarchical complexity. So my co-author and I, Henry Kurtz, we did a paper on Fowler's model, Fowler's faith development theory. We got 38 of the original faith development interviews. We scored them for hierarchical complexity, and we showed a strong and significant correlation between hierarchical complexity level, as measured by lectical score, and faith stage, to the tune of, I don't know, R of like 0.79 or something like that.
Forgive my complete ignorance of statistics, but what would R to 0.79 mean?
That if you're looking at sort of the line of regression, like, how much does this particular kind of, let's say, curve or line, how much does that account for, the trend that you're seeing, right? And so, like 1 would be, it's a total match, right? And so, and now, yeah, it gets a little messy, because we had to do certain kinds of statistical tests and then translate that into like a Pearson R and this sort of thing. And I am not the statistician amongst us. Henry did all that work. Yeah. So he'd be better to talk to you about that element of it. But we have been able to do these statistical analyses, principal components analysis and whatnot. And they basically show there is a variable, a shared variable, in this case, let's say 98%, of the shared of the variable accounting for development is sort of loaded on one factor. And so there is something here. I got a little bit ahead of myself, sorry, because I was talking about Fowler, but we've done this on multiple models, right? So I've also looked at Keegan's subject-object, kind of self-development model, constructive developmental theory. I've looked at Lovinger's model, looked at Graves and spiral dynamics materials, these kinds of things. And so some of these we falsified. Spoiler alert, like Graves's stuff doesn't hold up so well to a kind of hierarchical complexification trend.
As in his actual work, or what he was saying about things, or what does it mean to say his work doesn't hold up?
Yeah, so what I did there was in the work that he published, or was published posthumously, The Never-Ending Quest, he gives a number of samples from the interview, from the not interview data, the essay prompts that he would give to folks, and they would write a reflection on their conception of what a mature person was and all that sort of thing. And then this was from which he extracted these different levels. But he gives these materials in that book. And what I did was I had them scored for hierarchical complexity. So if they were actually sort of transcending and including and hierarchically complexifying, you'd be able to see that structurally. And in this case, that didn't hold up so well. So if you look at, for example, his examples of red, you've got one showing up at, late lexical level 9 and early lexical level 11, right? And you've got, so it's like a vast variability. There's not a clear, kind of trend.
So are there as many lexical levels as hierarchical complexity levels? Was it 16, I think, in that model, is it? And then most people are around 10 or 11 or something like that?
It's around, it's a 13 level scale, essentially. So it covers the same basic developmental terrain as you'd find in Commons, different terms for them. But same basic scale. Commons has a few additional high level orders that are kind of purely theoretical. And so they're not really found so much in the data, but formally they exist. But in terms of these basic 13 levels, it's all the same up to basically what's the paradigmatic stage in Commons' model. And so that's what those lexical levels are. But the incredible thing about the lexical scoring is that because of how it's done and the vast data set it's able to draw from and the incredible work that Theo Dawson has put in to developing this, you're able to get very fine-grained measures, right? So you're not just able to say, oh, that's level 10 or that's level 11. You're able to say, well, that's 1023, right? So each order of complexity is on the scale of 100. So level 10 would be 1000 to 1099, and level 11 is 1100 to 1199, et cetera. And you can get really fine-grained analysis that hold up, So I actually also did a paper. Well, I don't want to get off topic. There's so many ways that this is a fascinating thing that you can explore from lots of different angles. But the point I was going to get at was that these fine-grained differences make a difference. Like, they're actually really significant. And it's actually not so much this like broad range of complexity that most of the interesting things happens in. Pretty much all of human development let's say verbal human development happens from like level 6 to level 12. So that's only like 6 orders. And then if you're talking about adult human development, it's really only like, level 10 to level 12. So you're really only dealing with this narrow band of complexity. But when you have lexical scoring, you get this really fine-grained numbers that the difference between like a score of 1110 and let's say 1010 and 1095, like that's a very big difference in terms of cognitive complexity that you can see and feel and experience. And when you score that and you get that, you're like, oh, okay, well, it's abstract mappings or, full formal operations, but like you're able to see the difference there, and it is rather remarkable and telling.
So I'm curious about because I have a vague sense of what you mean by complexity, but I kind of want to concretize it a bit more. So yeah. Is it related to can it be correlated with IQ? Is it about like your we'll say the hardware processing ability, or is there something more to it?
Related, but also very different and in different and important ways. Going back, there are studies that Kohlberg even did looking at, basically his developmental model and looking at the correlations with IQ. There is a significant correlation, but they're not the same thing. And so one of the big differences, I think, is that when you're looking at hierarchical complexity, it's not so much like a hardware unit in your brain of a certain complexity. This is something that the neo-Piagetians clarified, in particular the work of Kurt Fischer was helpful for getting at, which is that it's actually a scale. So it's not like we have stage structures in our brains or that we are at a stage. It's that there's a scale of complexity, of task or skill complexity that you can use to look at any different performance, right? And so I can talk about physics, I can talk about religion, I can talk about any number of things, I can talk about my day, and you can assess that just linguistically at using a complexity scale. So it's a domain independent means to be able to assess the complexity of a performance. So that's important. And so that means that there is dynamism across how people are able to perform. And it will depend on, did I get good sleep last night? Am I hungry, or am I full, or am I interested or engaged in the task or not? These things will definitely affect actually your level of the performance of your complexity. Now, it's not endlessly arbitrary. There's usually a band or a range in which people operate in pretty regularly. But you can do things, if you're with someone and they're more advanced in a particular skill, they can scaffold you, so you can show definite increases in complexity when someone is working with someone who's able to kind of, help assist them. And similarly, you can see when people aren't being assisted and they're kind of working in suboptimal, conditions. But I think it's much better to appreciate that people aren't at a stage per se, but we tend to perform within a kind of range of complexity that can vary depending on circumstances and context. And there are upper limits to that, right? I mean, like, and age and maturation also plays a factor. So a 6-year-old is not going to be operating at, level 12, abstract principles. That just doesn't happen. There are certain aspects that need to come online biologically and maturationally for those capacities to even be possible. But also someone who is able to sort of operate at that stage maybe only does so in a couple of different domains, or maybe only one domain. Maybe they've studied this particular topic really, really in depth, and they're able to speak about it with great complexity. But then if you ask them about something else, they would draw on different structures, right? And so, Fisher talked about a skill web, and some skills that we develop influence or inform other skills that we have, but some are further apart and maybe have very little impact on other skills. So it's a much more nuanced picture.
Kind of task oriented then, more than rather than I was going to map it over onto a car and say that IQ could be horsepower. So like if you've got a very high IQ, maybe it would take less energy, or you've got more capacity to go to. I'm not sure if that maps over at all, but I'm trying to think. So, I'm gonna cast that aside entirely because I can't find the others. But is it about tasks? Is it about like, okay, your average academic, we'll say your average cognitive scientist, because that requires a certain level of complexity, I imagine, because you're bringing together these different fields, and that there's a kind of a meta abstract thing that's going on there. So that seems to be like that would require a high level of complexity compared to, I don't know, like texting my friend on WhatsApp. Like those seem like things that, is that the kind of thing you'd analyze and be like, oh, that task is very low, or could it go to something like cooking a meal? And like, I'm going to get the sense of what the cognitive element is here.
So there's a couple of layers to this. One is that the lectical scoring system uses language to assess this. So that's what it's based on. But there are other ways of assessing hierarchical complexity, right? Like I could build an engine and not be speaking at all, but in order for me to accomplish a certain task requires a certain level of complexity. But that's a kind of kinesthetic thing that, like, you can there are implicit levels of cognitive complexity involved there you can assess through the task, but that's not how like lectical scoring.
It's harder to measure. So so the examples I gave would probably be good then. Let's say someone writes a cognitive scientific paper, and then they're all like, you compare that with their text to their mother on WhatsApp. Like, so those are going to be two different levels.
Like, here's an example. So let's say I'm writing. So these are both linguistically mediated. So I'm writing a neuroscience paper, and I'm talking about, the system in the brain that does this function, we have been able to establish is coordinated with this system over here, which functions this. And there's certain opponent processes that go into the regulation of both of these systems, and they're able to achieve a kind of dynamic equilibrium by means of trade-offs with the energy inputs, et cetera. Okay, I've said all this thing in this essay. Now I'm texting my mom, hey, I had a great day. It was really cool. I met up with my friend Steve. We went to the store. I got a pizza. It fell on the ground, but we ate it off the ground, and we were ridiculous, and everyone hated us. Odd story. Steve's a bad influence. But the things that are going on there are, let's say the same person did this, right? Now, if you look at the paper, the neuroscience paper, you're talking about multiple systems that are being coordinated, and the processual dynamics that are, leading to these trade-off features, this sort of, that requires basically level 11 abstract systems to speak about, right? To understand, to talk about even, right? You cannot communicate some ideas without drawing on certain kinds of complexity structures, right? The very notion of, say, the limbic system as an idea has a basic level of complexity implicit in it, right? Now, that can be downward assimilated in some ways, but only to a point, right? So what lexical scoring does is it looks at words and phrases and then the structures that hold between them, but the vocabulary, the semantic units it works with, it tries to find the lowest level of complexity at which a word is useful or potentially useful to someone, right? So a word like recursive, right, is actually of a particular level of complexity necessarily, right? Like a 6-year-old isn't going to say something about something being recursive and have any understanding what that means, because its very meaning is bound up with something iterating, back on itself. And so you've got multiple, so this systemic language is what gets sort of indexed to particular levels of complexity. And then that's how that works. Now the paper then, therefore, the neuroscience paper is going to score very high in that regard because it's talking about these kinds of things. And so it's probably going to be, 1105 or something on the lexical scale. Now that text to my mom telling a story, same person, but they're just talking about something different. They're talking about what are basically representations, right? I did this thing happened. And actually systems or mappings of representations. So the basic idea of like a representation is sort of like, there is a glass, right? Or, there is a pen. You can just see, you can use language, you can represent kind of phenomena in your experience, but then you can start to bring these things together, into systems or something, right? So if I were to say in my text, we were going to go to the movie, but it was sold out and I was disappointed. So we decided to go to the gym instead and had a good time. That's actually a system there that's in terms of the structure of things that are going on. And it's also starting to draw on more abstract concepts, disappointed, right? So disappointed is actually an abstraction that emerges when you get multiple systems that you're able to see, I was disappointed in this context and in this context and in this context. Therefore, I have a more abstract thing that I can talk about that's a higher order of complexity.
So anyway, the basic matters of fact. So what was like if you were to kind of threw the number 1105 on the cognitive science paper, what kind of numbers would you throw on? We'll say that original text, the story with the Steve and the pizza, and then the sold out movie example.
Anywhere from like 980 to 1050 or something.
Okay, so it depends so it's still actually really high then.
There are two things I want to get at here that were part of the interesting findings and this sort of thing is so it depends on how much I draw on ideas like disappointed or, it was a weird thing to do, certain kinds of abstractions. If it was just more simple, like Steve and I went to the store, we left the store, we went into a new place, then we went here, certain kind of basic kind of representative language, it's going to be even simpler. It's probably going to be hanging out in like the 900s. What's interesting now about this is that looking at how we've assessed the complexity of different texts over time, because we're interested in worldviews, meaning-making structures. In our CCI project at IAM, we've been looking at, let's say, religious texts and scoring those and seeing what level of complexity show up in these texts. So something I did was I looked at biblical passages, and I looked at the early parts of the Bible, or the first 5 books called the Pentateuch, and I scored different passages from there. Now, in the earliest portions of the Bible, you've got these stories of Abraham and Jacob, the patriarchs, they're just going around places. If you just look at those texts, they're actually very simple. They're like 900s. They're like,
I remember jumping into the Book of Kings at some point, and it was like, and this stone in the temple was 9 cubits by 4 cubits.
Right, exactly.
And that stone was beside it, and it was 3 cubits by 4 cubits. And I was like, Jesus Christ. Not yet, obviously, but later in the book. But yeah, I was like, this is painful reading. But that's interesting because I would have thought maybe like the Book of Job seems like it would have a higher level of complexity. Like there's quite a lot going on there.
Yeah. And so what actually I did in one paper was, so there's theories about the different strands of the sources that went into compiling the Bible, right? So in the Pentateuch, there are these hypothesized 4 major sources, J, E, D, and P. And supposedly J and E are really early and come from like an oral context of like oral storytelling that then got written down. And D and P come from a later context where you had scribes already kind of, writing things already in a literary way. What I did was I broke up the different sources into those different parts. I had them individually scored for lexical scores, and then was able to demonstrate that there's actually a complexity difference in these different sets of sources. And we were able to do a statistical analysis and say that this is actually statistically robust.
I don't suppose you looked at Homer. I would be curious.
We've looked at Homer.
Yeah, because I was thinking that like kind of Bronze Age kind of writings, I wonder if there's a lower complexity with, and the Vedas as well. The Vedas are the original, right? And then
yes.
The Upanishads would be the.
Yep. So all that, and a couple things. I mean, again, I geek out so much about this.
I'm now fascinated. So cool. Where I'm like, okay, let's get into if we've got a good scale that we can measure by, and it's got decades of work behind it. Then I'm like, this is a fun who's your favorite Power Ranger quiz to go into.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really important here is that you can see a real shift that occurs when you get literacy in the mix, right? There are more complex texts that come out of scribal milieus. Basically, we've scored hunter-gatherer texts that are purely oral, and there's a big difference, actually like a whole order of complexity or more difference between purely oral storytelling and the kinds of storytelling that you start to see show up basically as you get into agrarian societies with, scribal bureaucracies, right? And there's a lot of anthropological and sort of cultural, cognitive, psychological insight about why that is, what literacy does to the mind, how it starts to generate second order thinking, and all this sorts of things.
That would also make me think that Homer's books would be less complex than the biblical books, because the biblical books, there's a sort of a scribal paradigm there, I guess, within which there's a nomenclature that they can kind of speak among each other. Now, obviously, that still needs to be communicated to the people, so there's still a limitation of audience, but like Homer is purely, a man for the people. He's at the Olympics, spouting his poetry.
Well, yes and no. This is so interesting. And again, it depends on how in the weeds we want to get here. But just to throw out some numbers, right? Like I already mentioned that early biblical stuff was, 900s. And then the later scribal stuff is like 1000 to 1025, somewhere in there. And what you actually see there basically is the difference between like late concrete operations and early formal operations, and like just sort of a Piagetian thing. Now, what's interesting, though, is that it's like, yes, when we talk about the Bible, though, some of it is deeply oral in nature, and some of it comes more from a scribal thing. We see those complexity differences. When we're looking at Homer's a really interesting example, because in some ways, Homer is just an oral poet. That's how he's kind of thought about, and you see those structures in what he's writing. But when we scored Homer, we got things always tended to float around 1050, which is sort of more advanced than I would have expected. I would have thought... Yeah. Yeah. And so then it's like, well, why is this the case? Now, there's a lot of potential aspects that could go into this, right? We are scoring these ancient texts in translation. The one I used for this was actually from the Loeb edition. So it's a pretty faithful translation in terms of like, it's kind of word for the Greek, but certain, nuances of meaning can creep into English translations that maybe weren't necessarily there in the original, et cetera. So there's some of that, but I don't think that accounts for all that difference. So then there's other things that you have to keep in mind. One is, so the recession history of the Homeric corpus supposedly kind of gets canonized or formalized under Pisistratus I think it was like in the 600s or maybe even late or early 500s BCE. So actually that's not as early as like early Homer. So it raises some questions of like, do we have, 9th century Homer, or do we have a later kind of a more... so we know at some point that we went from an oral story to a written text, and that got officialized and canonized at a particular point. Now, did that process occur at a point when a lot of these formal literary structures had become more normalized in society after the Bronze Age collapse and and Greece came back from the Dark Age? Maybe, right? That's an interesting question.
Other questions too, though. Gilgamesh? Epic of Gilgamesh?
We did look at Gilgamesh, yeah.
And?
Yeah. So that one is
fun.
I know, right? It's great. Yeah. So that, as I recall, was like around 1015 to 1025 or so. So
That's
like that one actually makes a lot of sense.
Surprisingly high for, yeah.
But it made back to, like, I mentioned P and D, the later Torah sources that came out of a scribal bureaucratic milieu. That's the same milieu that would have existed in ancient Mesopotamia, in the same kind of people generating Gilgamesh. So that actually makes a lot of sense. Some texts were actually very high. The most interesting one was the earliest text in the entire corpus, our archaic corpus, was from ancient Egypt. It's the Wisdom of Ptahhotep, very ancient text, like 2300 BCE. And when we scored that text, it's a wisdom text, but it was like 1080, right? Which is actually starting to get up into close to systems level thinking, but definitely advanced formal operations. And it's like, okay, but that also makes sense. It's a highly rational text. It's about wisdom. Again, complications. You're talking about a text that was translated from basically Egyptian hieroglyphs or whatever the language would have been. So how much we're dealing with a translational artifact
that
is
as a possibly mitigating factor in the complexity there, but yeah,
it always is. It's, I think, of varying degrees, right? So, like, I think,
assume if you got a translation of Aesop's fables, it's not going to show up in the 1100s. You know what I mean? It's probably going to.
Yes, exactly. There's like, there's a range in which you're going to expect to find things, but there's also a range of probably some noise and some error that is being related to translational artifacts. But also, again, like, I don't think much. It depends on the source. It depends on what it's translated from. But like, you can look at the structures of the Hebrew in which, the stories of Jacob and Abraham are told. And when you translate them into English, it's like, yeah, that's the same semantic, grammatical, basic thing going on there. There might be some shades of meaning or nuance that are potentially lost, but if anything, they're only added. So we're probably getting higher scores for these ancient texts than what they, might have actually represented from the cognitive status of the person writing them.
So what about like something like a thriller you'd pick up in a bookshop, or just like a modern thing that's made basically pulp, just made for selling and just grabbing people's attention and isn't meant to be complex. It's made for reading on the beach, so it's just easy whiling away. Like, what kind of complexity would you be looking at in something like that?
1050, 1070.
So it's interesting what we're considering high for like the ancient world is very
totally accessible. And I mean, but that's very interesting, right? I mean, one of the things, my main kind of research inquiry is around, is cultural evolution a learning process, right? So to what degree do we collectively learn? And that's why I'm drawing on these developmental models to see about worldview changes and collective ways of knowing that shift. And I think without a doubt, in a modern or postmodern context where you've got basically mass education and mass literacy, you've upped the default kind of level for the main population, right? So in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, 1 to maybe 5% of people were literate, right? And we've already talked about how that can change basically, a whole order of complexity. When you get 98 or 95 or so people in a society that are literate, because they had 12 years of formal schooling of whatever quality, that has real impacts. And so that levels up the entire population in terms of the kind of baseline, complexity dynamic that society is able to draw from. And so, if you're reading a thriller novel, it's not going to be particularly complex, but it's probably going to use words like, anxious and, startled and, unforgiving and stuff like that, right? Where it's just sort of like, actually, these are somewhat complex relative to maybe ancient structures of feeling, of a sensation. And so that's a very interesting thing. And also though, to give a sense of some of this as well. So Theo Dawson did some analysis of political speeches or interviews that presidents have done and scored those. And there's quite a range there. But again, that's sort of like a benchmark. Trump kind of speaks from around 1050, right? So if you kind of want to get a sense of what is going on in terms of that particular level of complexity, when he speaks to people, it's around that kind of formal operational mark. But 1050 is... let's say what you would hope a high school student gets to by the end of a high school career, basically. And so, whereas I don't know, like I think like Obama was the highest scoring one. He was talking about the economy and this and that, and he was upper level, level 11, like 1175.
That's interesting because I was reading. I just for the book club on Patreon and Substack, we're reading Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. and she gives the example of Gerald Ford in one of the later chapters as like had great policies but could not he couldn't boil it down to simplicity. So he was just like he could kind of hammer problems quite well, but then couldn't communicate that, and then that's like a big problem. And while you were talking as well, I was thinking about the, I guess, McLuhan kind of element to this of the Kuhn talking about the paradigmatic stage of a science when they develop their own language. So you've got your own nomenclature and you're just iterating on like the most archaic and there's parts earlier in this conversation where I'm sure people will tune in and they'll be like, I have no idea what these people I know one of my friends is going to be like, what were you talking about? And that's like the result of using some paradigmatic language, you know. That's like there's a level of like
jargon.
Yeah, and that is recursivity, I guess, where you're kind of saying, oh, you've used that, and now we've added that little bit, and now we're able to like iterate on that and like get into finer and finer nuance. But if you're trying to appeal to a broad audience, if you're trying to, like, Fox News is never going to run something with like a level of complexity like that because their goal is communication. Well, whatever their goal is, they have a goal. But let's not talk about the goal of Fox News. But it's this, it's going to be, you're trying to do a much broader communication. So
totally.
And that's why I expected the Homer thing to go a different direction. But yeah, but then it's
well, so I mean, you can start to see how, what do you say? These, like, speaking with greater complexity might be good from a policy angle, but it might not be good from a rhetorical political angle, right? So you can actually appreciate that if more folks in, let's say, contemporary American society resonate with ideas coming out of level 1050, and Trump is able to speak that language, then you're actually going to be able to understand better why that gets ground, why that has resonance. And then if Obama's up there in high abstract systems, people are like, this guy, he's
or they go, this guy seems like he knows what he's talking about. It
depends on the demographics that are responding to these, right? But I think that this leads to another issue, which is the whole complexity gap. And so, like, Robert Keegan in his book In Over Our Heads was like, look, modern society is predicated, it makes demands on us, and our institutions make demands on us to have a certain level of complexity to be able to deal with them effectively. And when you actually run the numbers and look at where a lot of people are at, they're actually falling behind what those demands are in our society. So there's this complexity gap, right? And I think that's a lot of what we see. So even though we were talking, just a second ago about like, well, yeah, you up the level of mass education, you're going to up the level of kind of what is the default mode in a particular cultural context. That's true. So the mode at this point is now at, let's say, 1050. Like, if you can't operate at 1050 in our society, that's going to put you at a disadvantage given the modern system that presumes competency at that level of complexity.
So I've been thinking about this in terms of American politics recently, because like the way you've structured your education system is crazy, of like just zip code based education. It's like, of course you're going to get this pooling of like higher and higher education in one area, and then lower and lower education. Like, the more the sparsely populated an area is, the less funding, so the less education level, and then you scale that up, and then all of a sudden you've got, I would say, like, much less complex. So like, they're not going to university level for the most part. Whereas in the blue chip cities, like the richer areas are going to be producing more people at a higher level of education, and then they're more likely to go on to higher attainment. So that one policy seems to be like a systemic thing that has led to a complexity gap within the nation, which could lead to this sort of thing.
Hyper complex situation, because one thing that's also happened in the States is people were seeing the numbers and they're like, hey, look what happens when you have a higher education. You're more likely to have higher quality of life. You're more likely to live longer. You're more likely to blah, 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 blah. There are all these positive indicators, right? So everyone's like, okay, everyone needs to get a higher education. And so then what? Then actually there were a lot of policies aimed at just filling up the higher institutions of education. But rather than that necessarily leading to all these downstream consequences of leveling up everyone's education level. I'm sure it had some impact there, but it also brought down the level of higher education in a sense, in terms of becoming a lot more sort of available to everyone. And so it's kind of like grade inflation in some way. And so what then happens is that, okay, you don't just need a BA, now you need a master's, and then you need and so actually you actually kind of wind up. So there are complex ways in which higher educational attainment does have these significant ways that people can maintain an advantage in a hyper complex society, but it's not just as simple as a variable that then can be, okay, well, because then of course people get into all this debt, and then they, and so there are many ways in which it's a big question. I think what we want to really, really grapple with is like, what does an equitable, fair, happy, just, sustainable society look like in terms of its education system, right? Like, what does that actually look like? Do we want everyone just trying to get advanced degrees? What kind of systemic problems are downstream of that? How do we deal with, differing levels of complexity that are endemic in society? You're going to have that always. One thing, though, that I do want to underscore about why I do think developmental models are a bit more optimistic than just say IQ. IQ has always been this genetically framed thing, right? It's sort of like you have it or you don't. Oh, well, you have a high level or you don't. It's like, I don't know, I've seen studies where it's like, 0.8% of the variable there is kind of accounted for by genetic inheritance, right? So it's like, okay, well, gosh, if this is basically a hereditary thing, then, and you're trying to say that all these things are downstream of having high IQ, then you're setting up a kind of eugenicist culture in which you're stuck with a genetic lottery, and what did you get, and who are the high achievers and who aren't, and what can we tell about your genes? It winds up becoming very ugly. And if people have read, for example, like the bell curve and some of that stuff, right, it leans in a direction that people, I think, rightly find really problematic.
Which is, I remember seeing even Douglas Murray talking about this, and he'd be quite a conservative thinker. And he was like, we just shouldn't look there. He was just like, that is like, if we want to have a civil society, that's just maybe somewhere we shouldn't look. Or I forget exactly how he phrased it, but he was totally. I don't want to know. And I can see his point, but like this complexity thing seems more a better foundation, even though the truth is the truth, I guess, is what some people would say. Sure. But if complexity is the real truth, then it's a more
well, it is, because it's a lot. It's more variable, it's more dynamic, and it's more contingent upon circumstances than just, there is probably some genetic component that goes into what range a person can operate in most of the time or something. But in terms of the scaffolding that's possible, in terms of, how people can develop skills in better or worse educational context, there's so much more we can do when we actually consider these factors than just IQ. And so I think the developmental models give us a very different picture from a more bleak kind of genetic inheritance. It's more like, no, we can change, alter, structure, restructure society along developmental lines, in the sense of, hey, if we actually prioritize people's growth, learning, development, all these things, then more people would have quality of life and higher quality of life and be happier. And all these downstream consequences that we've associated with higher education is actually just a lot of the consequence of, of attaining your potential, of you could say self-actualizing in some way, right? So anyway, I think there's a different story there, and I always try to emphasize that to it's
an interesting alternative. There's so many places I would love to explore more. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, and I didn't get to dig into that worldview, like the study. We kind of talked about some of the earlier stages, but what you'd actually be looking for. So I'm sure we'll be having more chats about this in future. But one last thing I had in mind was, how does all this, or how does meta theory, how does this connect with metamodernism? So that would have been your kind of primary concern before. Is this a different thing to metamodernism? Are they related? Or do you feel like you're moving from being a metamodernist into a meta theorist?
Deeply related. They are different, though. Metamodernism is a attempt to, get a hold of a cultural sensibility and worldview and set of sort of social systems, etc., But I think that there's a deep logic that it connects them both. And so in my book, Metamodernism, or the cultural logic of cultural logics, I think you can see what that is. We were talking earlier about this notion of like, theories leading to meta theories, and then meta theories leading to arch theories, and then presumably arch theories leading
meta arch theories.
And what that is an iterative, recursive move, right? That you're taking as object the thing that came before, and then you're able to step outside of that and reflect upon it and start using that as the basis of establishing higher order coordinations. And that's what meta theory does. But that's also what metamodernism, at least some versions of it, are claiming is going on. So that, the postmodern stood out from, reflected upon, critiqued the modern. The metamodern stands out from, reflects upon, critiques the postmodern. That's the claim. That's the cultural logic of these cultural logics or worldviews that I try to emphasize in my book on metamodernism that's going on. That's why you can see this as a developmental process and a complexification process, because later orders can do things that the earlier ones can't, because they're drawing on the insights of what came before, but they're adding to them. So in that sense, meta theory and metamodernism are very, very similar. Another reason, of course, is that some aspects of the metamodern discourse are deeply informed by integral theory and meta-theoretical models. And so to the degree that those meta theories are core to how metamodern and integrative worldviews are thinking, then doing meta theory is a highly metamodern, sort of activity.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I don't know if you remember, in one of my critiques of metamodernism, I wrote about the integral theory kind of cuckolding the metamodern nest of sneaking in and being like, hey, we're here. I wonder whether you could have metamodernism as an arts discipline and be like, that's over there. And I know Hansi wants to say that he's doing metamodernism, or he's not doing meta theory, but I wonder whether there's a distinction you could go in. And I guess you go through the different schools of metamodernism in your book, but that there's the meta-theoretic, rather than, we'll say post-integral, but meta-theoretic metamodernism, and then you've got the aesthetic school of metamodernism. That might be that meta-theory might be its own thing, and then related to, I guess, in terms of a level of complexity perhaps, but might be closer to that discourse of Hansi, yourself. I'm not sure where Storm fits in that, but that more developmentally minded side might actually be closer to meta theory than to the original idea of metamodernism.
I mean, there's different ways at that. As I try to get in with my book, I see a deep structure that unites these different ways of people talking about these things. It's clearer in some versions than in others, but I think it's present in all of them to varying degrees. And, at a certain point, and let's say maybe it isn't so much in the earliest articulations, particularly at the art level and the aesthetic sensibility stuff. But when you're talking about Hansi's work, and you're talking then about Jason Storm's work, I think, which definitely is doing this, and then you're talking about people who embrace this term, like Greg Enriquez as a meta-theoretician, and Bobby Azarian, and other folks engaged in, big meta-level discourses and big pictures. There seems to be a there to this structure. And so to the degree that metamodern has become a term that is used by these folks themselves and seems to be an umbrella of capturing this thing, I'm comfortable using it, in a broader sense. There's some ways in which we're often still trapped by a kind of fallacy of origins or something, or maybe just another way of putting it is that just where things come from isn't always reflective of the full entirety of what they can be or are even. I think that we don't necessarily want to give primacy to this is the first time that this word got used in this way, and so this is what it really means, right? A lot of
if
really
you did that with postmodernism, you'd just be talking about a school in architectural theory.
Exactly.
It's just at what point the legitimacy takes over and the nest has been thoroughly, because that's what not Leotard so much, but Jameson, what's his name again?
Frederick Jameson.
Jameson, where he kind of snuck in there and was like, yeah, we're gonna cultural logic the shit out of this, and we're making postmodernism a thing. Even though Leotard was like, it was a joke, bro.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I would say if it were just a matter of the cultural studies people and then Hansi, doing the cuckolding move and the Shanghaiing of the term, then I think that kind of claim has a lot more to it. But when you bring in Jason Storm's Metamodernism, the future of theory, and you see the moves that he's making, and when you see earlier forms of metamodernism, like Alexander Dumitrescu talking about integration,
Dumitrescu's one is,
and when you see like all these different things happening, and then even what shows up in the actual arts themselves, right? Like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is just ostensibly a metamodern art piece in some sense, and yet is dealing with, recursive iterative reflection and existential issues.
The complication with that one, I would say, is that they were explicitly doing a metamodern piece of art, whereas Bo Burnham is for me like the iconic thing where I'm like, this has got metamodernism written all over it, and he definitely hasn't studied that school of thought. But then there's like that video, and you reference it in the book, and that's clearly recursivity. So there is clearly overlaps. It's just one I love that idea because it's kind of the rhizomatic evolution of like, oh, we took that and then it turned into this complete other thing. And then it's like but let's see what everyone else is saying, and it's kind of a fun showdown to watch.
But I think also, my background's in religious studies, right? And so this happens everywhere, right? So if you're to look at like, well, what does Christianity mean in 1100, right? Compared to like, 200, they're very, very different things, right? But you have to account for how things have been picked up and moved and evolved, developed and changed. And that people can meaningfully in 1000 or 1100 be like, yes, I am a Christian, and so could people in the second or third century, and yet there's continuity and discontinuity.
Because it kind of comes into memetics there, doesn't it? It's like, well, what sticks? Like people felt like that was adjacent to that, and then at the end of the day, you got to go, well, what actually resonated and stuck with people? And I guess when you look at Christianity, it's a fascinating story of different things in different places and at different times. So the mimetic evolution is another part of that.
There's variation, and I do feel like probably the closest thing that gets at some of the more robust meta-theoretical recursive levels of metamodern thought is integral theory. But I think there's a lot of things about kind of a Wilberian integral, 1.0 that people are still trying to work through and beyond. And so I think that then just using a term like integral or even integral theory doesn't capture the full essence of something either. So there's a casting about, looking around for terms of like, what can we use? And ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't really care. It's not like a proprietary thing. It's not like a brand thing. Yeah. If we can just find some term where we know what we're talking about and can work together.
You're trying to find the mimetic center. Yeah.
So I think that there are interesting things happening. There's a notion of like fourth generation integral. It's a integrative meta theory 2.0 that's happening. All these different ways of talking about it. But I do see there beneath all the differentiation that something culturally is happening. It looks a certain way. It operates a certain way. It has a certain vibe. And it's really interesting to be sort of riding that wave and also trying to analyze the wave that you're on as it's carrying you forward.
Cool. Yeah. That's a good answer. And thank you so much for this talk. I'm aware of the time, so we'll wrap it up around there. But before we go, couple of questions for you. First of all, I'm doing a thing with the podcast where I get the guests to introduce me to someone interesting. It's delegating taste making. So is there anyone you could introduce me to who would be an interesting one to chat to?
Because this is the beginning of your podcast, right? I mean, I'd be curious to know, maybe it's fully emergent, but do you have a sense of the kinds of topics or categories or things that you want to cover, that you want to devote?
I have a few different directions. So there's some Jungian people that I'm interviewing. So that's like one line. And then there's just a couple of friends I have who are other YouTubers, kind of like politically or cultural kind of talking. And then that could lead into like a postmodern-y kind of thing. And then there's obviously this metamodern kind of strain. So just basically the directions of like, what have I been interested in? Who have I had good chats with? And then pursuing that.
Yeah. Well, okay, great. I guess a couple people immediately come to mind. There's my dear interlocutor, partner in crime, Layman Pascal.
Oh, actually, he would be good. Yeah.
He would be great. He's a wonderful person to talk to, utterly brilliant guy, but also deep kind of spiritual practice that that he's very self-aware and critical about as well. And so he brings a really unique metamodern
I've just
vibe.
encountered some of his stuff over the years, and I'm like, I love this guy's personality. Like, there's such his writing is so alive with like his personality that I quite enjoy it. So he's a great one, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, he can definitely hold court on a couple of things, and I'd love to see that conversation between you. So my mind immediately goes to him. Another person that comes to mind is Nick Headland, who's another person I'm working with at the Institute, and he's another person deeply engaged in meta theory. And if any of that is interesting to you, he could talk a lot more cogently about it. He's done some really good stuff there, and also just really brilliant, doing great things. So those would be two people.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brennan. And last question: where can people find you, or what would you like to?
I live in the woods, so stay away. No, I don't know. I don't update it much. Maybe I should
see what kind of education your neighborhood is.
Just my social security number you can put at the bottom of the screen. You can go to BrendanGrahamDempsey.com. That has stuff of mine. Increasingly, I've been operating more on my Substack. So if you look up Brendan Graham Dempsey Substack,
I'll put them in links in the description.
I've been posting stuff there.
And maybe the book as well. I know we didn't get actually to talk too deeply about the book, but maybe
if these things are interesting, my book series, which is really all one big book in my mind, it's called The Evolution of Meaning. But now the second volume has just come out. It's called Psyche and Symbolic Learning. And that's where I get into the research that I've been doing, some of which we've talked about. So that's really what's preoccupying me intellectually, and will be doing so for some time to come, as ultimately probably like a 10-volume series that is looking at that topic. Yeah.
Cool. I hope it's not like Wilbur's trilogy that you released one book. You're on to the second book already, so you're already past them.
I've got at least two at this point, so and an outline for a third. So
brilliant. As ever, this has been an absolute delight, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye, Brendan.